trade and Roman domestication of the dog. Um, so I primarily looked at literary sources such as writers as Pliny, who's on the left, and Varro on the right here. And the reason I did that is because um, I've spent the last 4 years at NYU studying Roman history and the classic texts, and what's missing often is any sort of information about the lower classes. And I thought this was a pretty unique opportunity to sort of try to uncover a little bit of that using animal domestication, because the treatment of animals in a society tells us just as much about the animals as it does about the human, domesticating them or how they're treating them. And so I look a little bit about how the changes, how these practices towards animal change over this time period, which is the late Republican period to the early imperial period, and I use that to learn a little bit about both the animals and the human side of domestication. And so in my paper, I sort of wrote about the two types of animals that were present in ancient Rome. Lean in here because this mic. Um, the first type is sort of your everyday house pets, as we would call them, and those are basically cats and dogs, which were both domesticated. And then you had your other type, which was those imported by the government that were largely wild from Africa. And most of the time, these were simply too wild or too large to domesticate. And then this picture down here just is an image of the exotic animal trade. You can see some ostriches, and what looks like a deer. So some of the exotic animals present in Rome are listed right here. And all these animals could be seen in the center of Rome between the late Republican period and the early imperial period. And whether it was in a sort of zoo-like setting, not exactly how we had it today, but sort of on show, or if it was in public mock hunts or fights that were originally put on by private companies, and then eventually the government took over this process and put on the shows themselves. And I'll explain why that's sort of important that the government took this over in a minute. But if you look here, I don't know if this mouse is showing up. No, but in this picture where you can see sort of the ring in the middle rightish size in the grass, that ring would have been about 3 or 4 seats high. And in the middle there would have been a post, and that would have been where exotic animals that were brought in from Africa were paraded around for the emperor, who sat sort of in this upper dome-like area that's collapsed obviously, to look down and pick sort of the most exotic animals that he wanted to see fight, or perhaps the best breeds that he wanted to keep for himself. But the purpose for including that was just to show how involved animals were in the lives of these people. I mean, this is the house of Augustus. I probably should have said that earlier. This is his main house, and a pretty significant feature in the house is devoted primarily and solely to animals. And so some attempts were made, just to get into more domestication, some attempts were made to domesticate these exotic animals that were brought in, particularly by Hadrian, who's shown here. He was actually accused of spending a little bit too much time trying to domesticate these larger animals, rather than actually leading. And the reason they wanted to do this, the reason that animals were so valuable to the government and the figures who led the government, was because the animals were used as a tool to increase what was called potestas, which is, you can see here, the power of the ruling class over the republic or empire as perceived by the lower classes. So how they would use these animals is, A, they would put on shows for the lower classes, which would entertain them and keep them satisfied. But B, by showing that they had the ability to dominate nature like this, and take exotic animals in from a land that was completely unknown to these people, and just totally control the lives of these animals, it was their way of showing their authority and their power over man and over nature. Um, and so it was in their interest to have a steady flow of these animals, and they did try to domesticate them and breed them, but like you can see here, some of them were just, most of them were just too large and dangerous to successfully domesticate. And then eventually, the demand died out as the lower caste citizens sort of developed less and less of a taste for these mock fights and hunts. Ooh, not enough time. So then the domestication of the dog, stark contrast between the treatment of the dogs and imported animals. Really high level value placed on all breeds of dogs. And there's an incredible level of written detail concerning breeding and training of dogs. This is a comparison between two um, Roman writers who wrote on, sort of gave advice about the best breed or the best characteristics to look for when breeding a dog. And if you look, you can see in the ears category that both mention hanging ears, which we know to be characteristic of the domestication syndrome. But what's really important about this is that the level of detail, I mean, the number of categories and the extensive writings on what constitute not only a good dog, but a good guard dog, more specifically, shows just how invested they were in breeding dogs. And then, so finally, I just have a picture here of a mosaic in Pompeii which says Cave Canem, beware of dog. And you can see the ears are not down, but instead are pointed up. And I don't know, I thought maybe the guy who made this was aware that domesticating dogs makes their ears flap, and so putting a more wild one with ears up would make it look a little bit more scary. All right, thank you.